Do it.
Do it.
Welcome to the Austin Otaku Podcast, hosted by Jesse McDonald and Keith Good.
All right. Welcome back to the Austin Otaku Podcast, now officially named the Austin Otaku Podcast. My name is Jesse McDonald. I will be one of your co-hosts today, and returning with me is the fabulous Keith Good.
I'm fabulous. Keith Good. Yeah, that's me. Just fabulous on a Friday. Welcome back to the Austin Otaku Podcast.
How you doing, Keith?
I'm splendid, thank you. It's been a busy week. We've had a lot of work going on, but you know what? I've actually been doing a lot of work on the side as well.
Awesome.
We should actually have an official website and web presence by the end of the weekend.
What do you know? The SEOs were like, hey, let's build a website as well. How about that?
So yeah, you should be able to find anything you need to see about us probably let's just call it Sunday at www.austinotaku.com.
That's awesome. Yeah, Keith's been working really hard on the site, and it looks great. So we're excited for that to go up. And as soon as that's up, we can build our RSS feed and then get all of the episodes onto any major podcast resources out there. So your Spotify, Apple Music, things like that. So keep an eye out for that if you are one of the, I believe, 10 people that listened to the first episode.
Hey, and they can be the ones that said, I remember when that podcast went nowhere. Just kidding.
When we were an underground band. So we're very excited to have our second episode, but first official episode with our new format and our very first guest. And our first guest ever on this podcast is a dear friend of both of ours, former semi-work companion, almost kind of like a work cousin, but amazing friend, a human being I consider a brother, Topher Kohan. Topher, how are you, buddy?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, guys. I'm super excited to be here. And oh my God, first guest. It's like first comment, but better.
Yeah, totally. You're our I guess you would say our guest cherry, and this is popped.
That's wrong.
Oh dear.
Oh my gosh.
I'm gonna have to edit that out.
Nah, leave that in.
All right.
Leave that in.
Won't have mom listen to this one.
One of the 11 people that will listen to this one will hate this. But yeah, thanks again for being on. When we posted that we were doing this, you were the very first one to express interest, and I could not think of another human being that I would like to have had as the first guest. So thank you again for doing this.
No problem. I'm excited to be here.
I personally would have rather had Patrick Stewart, but hey.
Make it so. If you can make that so, all about it.
If you can get Patrick Stewart, you can tell him he was the first guest.
Yeah, 100%. And then if you can get Patrick Stewart and Ian McKellen at the same time, then this is your podcast moving forward. You don't need me anymore.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, for those that listened to the last episode, it was a little more of an experiment, a little more improv, spitball, just Keith and I running with a theme. But we decided, moving forward with guests, we were going to kind of make sure that we had questions lined up, and we're fully prepared for this, so it became an exciting conversation. And stick around for the end, where we're going to do our lightning round, where Keith asks some of the tougher questions to our guests, and we're going to see about making that a recurring theme. So stick around, or fast forward to the very end. So right out of the gate, Topher, tell us a little bit about yourself, personally and professionally.
Wow, my voice decided to change during the podcast.
Welcome to puberty.
I was going to say, right? Puberty's a hell of a thing, man. You'll get through this.
I know, right? So I'm Topher Kohan, as Jess said. I am a professional SEO, have been for a little longer than I care to admit in public. Before that, I worked in the entertainment industry as a tour manager and production manager and lighting designer. I did local regional theater. I did a lot of touring with ballet and some rock and roll bands along the way. Then got into doing SEO through a little side business I had. Most people who are in the SEO industry know me as the guy who was the SEO for Turner Digital News for CNN.com. And then I moved from there, did some agency work. And then from there, I went on to Weather.com, which is how I became work cousins for these two when IBM bought them. And then I've recently left IBM / the weather company and moved over to Cox Automotive, and now I'm the senior manager of SEO for them, for autotrader.com and kbb.com and some other sites.
That's awesome. Yeah, you've had such an interesting career journey, and it's one of those things where as soon as I met you and you told me a little bit about yourself, I was like, oh, this guy knows what's up. So we know a little bit more about you professionally. What does your non-professional life look like?
I usually sit in dark rooms a lot, drinking bourbon, rocking back and forth, listening to Sarah McLachlan. But
Good call.
No, I'm a geek. I'm a pretty big geek. I have been my entire life. I'm the right generation that I saw Star Wars in the movie theater in 1977 and picked up playing all those games that the church told me I was going to go to the hell for playing in the late 70s, early 80s, and everything in between. I played early video games. I had Atari 2600 went back in the day.
And to be fair, we should probably state that none of us knows whether or not we're actually in hell right now. We could be. I mean, it is 2020.
That's a very true fact. It's a very true fact. But this is not the hell I learned about in church. I'm just throwing it out there. So that's my thing. I'm if you follow me on Instagram or Twitter or stuff like that, I take lots of pictures of me cooking on my grills, which I love to do, or of me painting miniatures for my tabletop games, and of my dog, which, is, she's going for a record of being 4th month in a row of employee of the month for the company. So fingers crossed she gets it. Fingers crossed.
Nice. Hey. Very nice. Yeah, that's one of the things I noticed when you wrote back in and you submitted your form, because you and I, Jesse and I were talking about how many areas we overlap with our own Venn diagrams. And for you and me, our Venn diagrams have overlapped, obviously in SEO, right. Obviously at IBM as a former IBMer yourself, and Star Wars. That was sort of our biggest connecting point, I think, because you and I are both classic Star Wars kids, 1977, the class of 1977, I would call us, because we were there at the time. But tabletop gaming, I knew obviously that you were, you'd mentioned being a dungeon master in the past, and tell me how you got into that.
I can't remember if it was 79 or 80, but somewhere in that period, right? So late 70s, early 80s. My dad and my mom and dad bought me what is now called as the Red Box, which was the starter set for basic Dungeons and Dragons. And I had no one to play with. Let's be very clear. I got this box. It was like the holy grail in my hands. I'd seen the commercials and, read about the ads in the back of some comic books. So I'm sure I said I wanted it. And I went through and I read it 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 and then I read it and then I read it and I read it. And I just fell in love with the idea of I could be someone else somewhere else. Right? This is long before I knew people made a living. Like, I guess I intellectually understood that the people on TV weren't really driving a van with a red stripe on the side of it. And, I guess I intellectually understood that, but I didn't get the fact that you could make a living pretending to be someone else. And so I did that. And it wasn't till, I guess, about 2 or 3 years later that I met some kids in my neighborhood who were playing Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which was the next step up. That's the first hard books. And I started playing with them, and I thought this was really great. The funny part, that's probably the last time in my life that I knew every single rule of Dungeons and Dragons by heart. So I played that, and I enjoyed the heck out of it, and I really did. I went off to college and went to Virginia Commonwealth University. Go Rams. And they had a school-sanctioned gaming club, which was totally cool. And I met these guys, and I started playing D&D with them. And I played all these other tabletop games. There was a game called Champions where you were these giant robots. Robots and superheroes. And I played Cthulhu Gaslight, all these really cool games, and had met some really cool people and enjoyed the heck of it. And then this thing called Second Edition Dungeons and Dragons came out, and I stopped playing. By the way, most purists in Dungeons & Dragons will tell you Second Edition is probably their favorite edition. It wasn't because I didn't like it. It's that I was a broke college kid and couldn't afford new books. And so all of my friends started playing the second edition. So I kind of just drifted away from it. And I drifted away from it for a really long time. I would pick up, an occasional dungeon magazine, the official magazine every now and then, or every now and then I'd be in a bookstore when you'd still go to a bookstore and see the new Player's Handbook or Dungeon Master's Guide on the shelf, and I'd flip through it. But I kind of just stopped playing it. But I really kind of got the bug, but I didn't have time to commit to it and everything. I started working at CNN, and as you guys probably know, most people who know me know, I got really lucky when I was there. Not long after I started there, they started their blog system, right? They were one of the first clients on WordPress's VIP, which allowed them to spin up blogs pretty quickly. And one of the blogs that they spun up was called Geek Out, geekout.cnn.com. And it was a geek culture blog. And I did a couple things for them. One of those things I did was I wrote every Wednesday, I did a lineup of what comic books came out, and I got to interview some really great people, Stan Lee, Kevin Smith, McFarlane, a bunch of great people about the comics and stuff. I wrote about pop culture in general and everything. But then I saw this ad. It's the first time in my life ever a Facebook ad has had a profound change on my life. But it was a Facebook ad for this new thing called D&D Adventurers League. Right, this is during the 4th edition of Dungeons and Dragons. And it was very much, it was every Wednesday. You go to your local friendly gaming store. It's 2 hours long. You don't have to show up. You show up with a pencil and that's it. You don't have to show up with a pencil. Just show up, say, I want to play. They'll give you a pre-generated character, some dice, a pencil. You sit down and you play for 2 hours. If you can make it next week, you get to continue on. If not, that's totally cool. Come back whenever you can. And I thought, well, this is awesome. This is what I want. So I went to another friend of mine, Larry Frum. Peace out, Larry. He'd become my writing partner for a couple of things. Before that, I did a video podcast for CNN, for CNN's tech section called Tech Torture with Topher, where it was a video podcast. And this was, you got to remember, this was 2008, 2009. So the iPhone was relatively new. There was no iPads yet. And they would do things like take away. I couldn't use my computer internet unless I was in the office. How did that affect me? I went to a conference. I went to SMX East, I think, and I couldn't use my laptop. I had to do the entire conference on my phone, on my iPhone. This was an iPhone 2, right? So to see if you could do that kind of stuff, right? And then I would record these little vignettes and say, this is the problems I'm having. Here's the issues I'm having, right? So Larry helped me with that quite a bit. And so he kind of became my writing partner. And they sent us to this store. We reached out to Wizard of the Coast, who now own the rights to Dungeons and Dragons. They said, yep. They picked the store for us to go to. The store loved it because they got like a crate of like WotC D&D swag to put up in the store to make it look good for the two guys from CNN, right? And we went and played, and we finished up. We came like halfway through the first season of this thing, and then we wrote the article, and it went out. Well, I went back and kept playing and kept playing and kept playing. And then my local friendly gaming shop started doing it, and so then I became I started running Wednesday night D&D for them. The thing that really kind of changed it all for me is that I got this random call from the PR department at Wizard of the Coast, and they said, "Hey, can you get to Seattle? Can you get to Redmond, Washington?" And I was like, "Okay." So we want you to come on up. If obviously because you're a journalist, we can't pay for flight or hotel or anything, but we'll take care of everything else while you're there. We can't really tell you what it's about, but we think you'll like it. So it was myself, someone from a prominent blog, someone from the New York Times, and someone from Forbes were invited. And that's when they announced when they told us about the new version of Dungeons & Dragons, D&D 5th edition. And so I wrote about it, had the art about it. Long story short, I enjoyed it. I then started pro bono working for Wizard of the Coast, promoting organized play in the Southeast. I walked away from that because of how, I had the jobs and that kind of stuff, and I didn't have time for it. And then I've been running D&D ever since. This was 2008. I got back into it, 2009. I've been running a home game in both editions. Now we're running it online via a virtual tabletop. And I still, up until the coronavirus happened, every Wednesday I go to a local friendly gaming store. We have about 60 to 70 people show up, and they sit down and they play D&D, and I make sure everything runs smoothly.
That's awesome.
And that was probably way more information you guys wanted. I'm really sorry.
No, that's perfect. That's awesome. See, it's really interesting. I I mean, obviously, I'm a little bit younger. Not making an age joke, just that's a fact. And in middle school, high school, 3E was a big thing. D&D 3E. So I've always held that as the gold standard, especially in my friend group. And I mean, it was one of those things where I didn't play a huge amount, but it was very inspirational to me. I've always found it very almost overwhelming, but I have little spurts where I get into it. Actually, the week before we went full work from home at IBM and kind of the quarantine started, Keith and I hung out with our other friend from work, Jeremy Candelas, and my wife, who was still pregnant at the time, and I ran a campaign. I started up a campaign, and I have a few little side adventures planned out, but we just haven't been able to get to it since my daughter was born. So I've always really looked to you as a source of good information and inspiration for D&D. There's been a few questions I've asked you, and you've always been so super helpful. But one thing I was wondering, because we've talked a little bit about some other games. I had this idea for a story last year, and was trying to turn that into an RPG. So I was doing some research and was asking you about the Star Wars tabletop game. But I was wondering, what is it about D&D specifically that resonates so heavily with you? And I mean, I know that you play other games, but why do you always go back to something like D&D?
I think it's two reasons. One, it is the world's largest tabletop role-playing game. It's played by more people than any other tabletop role-playing game in the world. So there's a lot of people to talk to it about, and it's just a lot of resources for it. That's number one. Number two, as much as I love Star Wars, and Star Wars is my first and true love on the planet, outside of my wife, and I don't know, I think it could be tied with my dog. I love the medieval fantasy setting. One of the first novels I remember reading was a D&D novel. I shouldn't say that. Obviously, the book that changed me to make a reader was The Hobbit. Right, I read The Hobbit, and so obviously early D&D, the original D&D, was very heavily influenced by Tolkien and The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. So it was an easy move for me.
The Tolkien estate actually sued Gygax for some stuff, didn't he?
Right. The race that is now called halflings were called hobbits in the original printing of the original rule set.
Ooh. And things like int are spelled differently now, so it's more like ant, and it has to say tree ant. Yep. So there's a bunch of little things that still resonate. That's interesting.
There's a funny thing is the fact that I think it's 5. There are only 5 monsters in all of Dungeons and Dragons that they own.
Really?
Yeah, everything else is pulled from public domain / mythos and lore. But yeah, there's 5 creatures, monsters that they created for the game.
Oh, interesting. Huh. Isn't it, if I'm remembering correctly, isn't orc spelled differently in D&D than it is in the Tolkien universe?
Yeah. There's an infamous book that came out in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons called Deity and Demigods, which they had, if you're a Michael Moorcock fan, they had Elric of Moldabar and Stormbringer in the book, his sword. And there was the publishing company said, you can't do this. And they said, but we have a letter from Moorcock's estate, from Moorcock himself. They said, yeah, but we own the rights with the publishing company. So they had to republish the book. Wow. Some issues with, they put Cthulhu stuff in books, and most Cthulhu is public domain, but the way they put it in there, actually, Chaos, there's another gaming company, owned the rights to this specific kind of Cthulhu monsters and Cthulhu mythos, because they'd licensed it from Lovecraft's estate, kind of thing. Yeah, there's been a couple of missteps along the way in the early days of TSR Hobbies.
I'm really curious about your impression of real world props, and how do they actually enhance the game from what you've seen?
So it's funny you say that. I'm a big fan of having some, whether there's 2 schools of thought. It's the theater of the mind, like I'm just going to paint a picture for you with words, and then you're going to go on and you ask me questions, you go, but which I've done and I do. But when I was having in-person games, people were coming to my house every once a month or twice a month, depending on schedules, I would do very well to try to build and put some sort of 3D scenery and or props on the table. Some of the stuff I bought, there's lots of companies that make the stuff now. Two of my players have 3D printers, so if I ask for a very specific item, like I need this one specific thing to sell this, like a throne or whatever, I have these little teleportation rings in my world that helps me as a DM get them from point A to point B much faster. So one of the players, I found a file on Thinkiverse that was the perfect thing if they made this one adjustment. And one of my players was like, yeah, I could totally do that, and made the adjustment and printed me out 5 of them. So I painted them up and I use them, throw them on the table whenever that has to happen, right? There's a pretty big community out there of people who this is what they do, especially on YouTube. One of the guys who DMs and plays with me at Titans Game of the Comics, a guy named DM Jim. He's the tabletop engineer YouTube channel, and he's that's what he does. He shows you how to take insulation foam from Home Depot and cardboard from your cereal boxes and make really great scenery that looks good on your table. I think it adds that next thing. Do you need it? No, not even a little bit. But I think it adds that next level right now. I have never got into something like LARPing, live action role playing. I know I have lots of friends who do. The rock and roll for them, if that's their creative outlet. But the idea of me personally hanging out in the woods and in a cloak and throwing sandbags at people screaming fireball is not my idea of no. I want to make sure I'm saying this, that I'm not making fun of those people. That's their geekdom, and I support all geekdoms. If they want to go out and do that, rock and freaking roll, man. If that's how you and your group of friends, tell a story, because that's all tabletop RPGs are. I don't care if it's Star Wars, D&D, Traveler, Cyberpunk, whatever. It's just telling a cooperative story with you and your friends. And that's the reason I keep coming back to it, man, is that I get to tell this cool story with my friends and they get to help me tell the story. It's not my story. It's their story. I just help them tell it. And I just think that's so freaking cool, man. I loved it. I ran a D&D. I ran a Star Wars game for a while. I ran a Star Wars tabletop game for a while, the new Fantasy Flight system. And it was cool. I set it, what would now be the post-Rogue One, Star Wars time period. And it was just a fun because I get to tell Star Wars stories, and that was just cool. That group broke up, and I never really got it back up together, which makes me a little sad. But yeah, so that's kind of my feeling. And I think it enhances it pretty greatly, and in my mind, at least with my players in my storytelling. But no, I don't think you need it. I just find it cool, and I like to make things.
Yeah, yeah, and if you get a chance, I don't know if you've had a chance to see this or not, but there's a fantastic video on YouTube of Joe Manganiello's Dungeons and Dragons group in Hollywood, and it's a bunch of Hollywood elites that show up at his house, which has some incredible props on the table. If you get a chance to look this video up, I think it was a piece done by Variety. But they've got Vince Vaughn, you've got Tom Morello, you've got Paul White, the Big Show that are a part of this game. Just powerhouse people, and you're like, wow, these guys are all into this. And of course, the layout that they've got on the table is just awe-inspiring. But it's really interesting to see someone. They call them Hollywood elites. I don't know if any of those guys are, the elite, so to speak, but they're certainly well-known folks. And the fact that they, despite being in very creative roles in their careers, still play Dungeons and Dragons and still need that creative outlet. It's amazing to me. And I think it certainly sheds new light on the hobby in general, and certainly in my old sort of puritanical Southern Baptist upbringing, it sort of again gets rid of some of that old stigma that's associated. Unless, of course, Topher, you have in fact worshipped the devil during one of your storytelling times.
Not the devil per se. Let's be clear about this. So I have seen that video, and there's another one where he shows off his. I don't think it's his house anymore. I think they've actually sold that home. But he bought a house in L.A. with his wife, Sofia Guerrara, and they found that there was an old wine cellar there that she wanted to turn into like a Pilates dance room.
Yep.
That he turned into a D&D room. I think it's those moments. And then there's they call them actual play video podcasts. Critical Role is by far the best known of those.
Yep.
Where they have kind of, if you're a geek, Matt Mercer because he voices probably half a dozen of our favorite video game characters, right? I'm a huge McCready fan and Overwatch, and I knew Mercer, did that, and there's lots of other really smart people in that fun people in that group, and they've kind of brought this mainstream where this isn't a show that's on the internet for 3 hours every other week, and people watch it like it's appointment television, and they get into the Twitch channel and they talk to each other, and they built a real community there. I think if you want to know if D&D is mainstream or not, from San Diego Comic-Con at home, they have panels of people playing Dungeons and Dragons. The biggest pop culture event in the calendar year has put a time aside you can watch people play Dungeons and Dragons. That's the popularity of this now. Is that good? I think it's fantastic. More people get to play this game I love. Is it bad? At the same time, but is that there's a good with the bad. There are people, I know this for a fact, when I was still running the every Wednesday at my local friendly gaming shop, which I'm going to give a shout out to Titan Games Comics here in Smyrna, Georgia. Mike, Katie, Leo, and Jay and Caleb run a great shop, 100% friendly to everybody, boys, girls, and everything in between. Make
sure to send us a link to them so we can put them in the show notes we have.
I will. They are by far the most welcoming store I've ever been in my life. And we've had people come in and play and sit down and play, and at the end of the night, I new players, I go up to them. I go, "Hey, how did it go? Did you have fun? I'd love some feedback." He goes, "Well, it was cool and all, but it wasn't like watching Critical Role." Well, as much as I'd love to have professional voice actors as every one of my dungeon masters, I'm not going to do. I can't have that, right? And so there's a little bit of a downside of that. I'll take that downside because for the first time ever, D&D, Dungeons and Dragons, has sold more than Magic the Gathering for Wizard of the Coast.
Wow.
At the end of 2019. So that shows you the power of that game.
And the fact that you can go into Walmart and buy the Dungeon Master's Guide.
Yes.
Or Target or wherever is huge.
No, you're right. The fact that there was a Rick and Morty box set, a starter edition. There was a Stranger Things starter edition. Right. The fact that exists is just, it's pretty magical.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that you brought up Critical Role because when I had the idea earlier in the year, I really want to learn how to play this game. I got a couple extra books that I was missing. Started really diving into it to play a little bit more seriously because normally when I would play, no one knew the rules other than the basics, so it would just be kind of like a make it up as you go, which is totally fine. That's a okay way to play. You don't have to know all the rules as long as you're playing. That's what matters. It's like Monopoly, home rules work. But I wanted to know a little bit more so I could tell a story because I had a story in my head and I'm actually writing it out as we play to turn it into some sort of novelization or prose of some sort. But I wanted to know more, so I looked into Critical Role because I'm a big Overwatch guy, so I knew Matt Mercer. And I love it. It's great. You can listen to it as a podcast, or so as you're working, you're listening to some really talented people play D&D. And it's really funny that you mentioned Critical Role and Keith mentioned Joe Manganiello, or however you say his last name, because Joe actually, while he's done a really good job of bringing D&D to the forefront of popular culture again, he actually participated in Critical Role and actually played a really big part in the way their campaign shifted. And he has some props in his collection based off of that chunk of the story. Which is really interesting because what he did was huge. It was absolutely huge. Their campaign shifted everything, basically hands down on the table, got up, walked away. Everyone's jaw was on the table and Matt Mercer just had to keep going. And it was amazing. It was really cool. And he has props related to that in his D&D dungeon. Right. I was going to ask you as someone who is big into the prop world, because I'm not necessarily. For me, it's still very much a storytelling element, but I don't necessarily have props. I might get into that because I do enjoy model building. So it's definitely a possibility in the future. But for some reason, the acting out your character thing is just wildly uncomfortable to me. So I don't necessarily participate in that. But the props thing is kind of a cool idea. I wanted to ask you, what's a maybe what's the most impactful usage of props that you've ever had in a campaign, / what is something that you have in your collection that means a lot to you, maybe based off of something that you've done in a campaign?
So I'll do the second question first. Is the Wizard of the Coast put out a line of pre-painted minis. They still do now. They use WizKids to make them. They self-produced them before. And they did in those, they did something called icons, which were these iconic creatures from the Wizard of the Coast world, from the D&D world. And I owned the ancient red dragon, which is like, I don't know, 1.5 feet tall.
Compared to the TIE fighter behind you, which we're not doing this as video, so no one can see, how big would it be?
It's as tall as the wing.
Okay, so that's a good 2.5 feet, maybe.
Yeah, when the average miniature of a player character is about a 1/2 inch tall.
Wow.
Right, and so it's just, the wings are all spread, and it's breathing. It's got a fire breathing thing, and this, and it was a gift from my cousin. He found I didn't have this in my collection, and he went and got it for me, and it sits on my shelf, and I love that. And I have lots of little things like that of gifts from players that I've used in games, whether it's the stuff that one of my players have 3D printed, or someone said, "Hey, I know you play D&D, and I saw this and didn't know if you had it," and it goes. It goes in the room where I play my games. But the piece of scenery that has most had the impact for me was not in my current campaign, my old campaign. They were traveling along, and they had to fight a beholder, one of the 5 monsters that Dungeons and Dragons created. Which is if people know the beholder, it's think of like a ball with a single eye in the middle, but it has a bunch of eye stalks that come out of, like tentacles that come out of it, and there's an eyeball at the end of it.
Looks like a jacked up Medusa.
Yes, and it's evil and blah blah blah. Well, I really went all in, and I got my pink foam from Home Depot, and I built the room and the walls and the whole thing, and built a pedestal so the beholder would be hovering at the right height, and did the whole boogie, and it was part of a thing where the thing was filling with water, right? So there was that added, like, we've got to figure this out and get out of here, because if we don't, we'll not only will the monster kill us, but we're drowned, right? And to simulate where that was, on one side of the wall, one side of the long wall, I put a slit, and I took some blue fabric, and basically every turn would raise it slightly, and that was the height of the water.
That's awesome.
So the players could see easily, there's their character. This is how far underwater they were having. And then they would have to take part of their turn to go above the water to catch their breath, right? And then go back down and fight the monster, kind of thing. So that, by far, I think, is the players who were in that campaign still talk about that moment. and how the scenery kind of added to that, to the thing, to the anxiousness of it all.
That's fantastic.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that's really fantastic. I'm wondering, I recently have been trying to watch terrible movies on Amazon, just finding the worst movie I could potentially find. And something that popped up on my my suggested list was Zero Charisma. Have you had a chance to watch this movie before?
I have.
Yeah, it's actually filmed here in Austin, believe it or not. So I'm curious if you've had an opportunity to run across people like Scott from that. Have you run into anybody who's pretty much unable to let tabletop gaming go during their day-to-day life?
I have, mostly through promoting the game at conventions, which is what I did when I was the Southeast Regional Coordinator for Adventurers League. I would promote it at conventions and events and stuff. I would run into those people then. I think that the people in my home game are all, are not that way. But I think there are some people, and for, I want to make sure I say this the right way. That there are some people that this is their escape. This is how they deal with reality. Mm-hmm. And that's totally great. That's great that they found a way to do that. And for me personally, it is part of my life. It is not my life, but for some people it is. And good for them that they found that way out.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep.
But yes, by all means, Keith, I have run into those people, and and sometimes they are more well-adjusted than others. I hate to admit it.
Yeah, and I'm curious about your reaction to the film, because I wondered when I was watching it, is this a I don't know, are they sniping people? Are they basically going after a group of people unkindly? And was this an unfair portrayal of the D&D community? Which, though, in the movie it wasn't D&D, it was a different, right? So they could avoid copyright issues. But did you feel like that was sort of an unfair portrayal?
I think they took the lowest common denominator because it made the most interesting story / easy target.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, if you've been to a con of any sort,
right,
you've seen folks who they're really into it, and it's I think for a lot of people who I think consider themselves normal, it's very easy to judge in those circumstances, and you can say, well, I'm going to basically whittle this down to the lowest common denominator and make fun of it. Yeah, so I had that reaction to the movie myself, because I felt like, well, okay, they're making him out to be a very bad guy, and at some point at the end they redeem him, though. So I thought, okay, well, now he's, I'm not going to give away the plot, by the way, so I won't spoil anything about what happens at the end. But there is a road to redemption of some sort in there. But the fact is well, somebody who made this film thought there was a need for redemption.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I mean, here in Atlanta we have something called Dragon Con, which is one of, if not the largest multi-genre sci-fi fantasy cons in the country, fan run, and there are people whose entire Dragon Con is they show up on Thursday afternoon and they leave on Monday afternoon, and they never leave the D&D area.
Wow. They
don't go to panels, they don't go to do other things, they don't go to parties. They sit and they play D&D from sun up to sundown every day. And by the way, that's their con, and that's cool. And this is their one big time, and their friends, there are people there that they only see that one time a year, and this is their chance to hang out with them. And this is their world.
Some people might judge us SEOs who go to PubCon every year and stay up past midnight hanging out with each other.
Right. No.
For the same passion. So
right. It's not the same thing. I mean, I'm sorry. It is exactly the same thing. I didn't mean not to. It's exactly the same thing that we. It's a geekdom's a geekdom. I don't care if your geekdom is knitting and crocheting, or if it's SEO, or if it's playing Dungeons and Dragons or playing video games. It's whatever it is. Yeah. I think that it's healthy and good to have those geekdoms.
Indeed. And see, I wonder what that's. If this current pandemic is going to make those kinds of bonds stronger, especially within those geekdoms, because I know it's been hard knowing that I'm not going to be able to go to PubCon this year and see my family. I'm not going to be able to see Topher. I'm not going to be able to see all the people that I see probably once a year that are truly like second family to me. Right. So I wonder what that's going to do to the kind of like the D&D community.
So it's funny is that I've thought about that a lot too. We had a pretty strong community at Titans, at my local family gaming store, and I think that is probably fractured now. I think that it's going to be almost like starting over, because a lot of these people, that's how they interacted, was every Wednesday they would come see each other, right?
Yeah.
If somebody's birthday fell on a Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, we would make sure we had cake for them. I would call them out when I did my announcements. I did announcements because there's always new people, and make sure I went over the store rules and the general, rules, everything from be kind to each other to, believe it or not, I had to tell people not to put dead animals in the refrigerator.
When props go overboard.
No, to the pet store in the same shopping center, and somebody had bought stuff for their pet. It's a whole thing. So I'm curious. I'm with you. I'm curious what's going to happen with that. It's interesting as my home group. I was friends with them. I am friends with them. Two of them are really darn close friends who I've been friends for years. Another two I met playing D&D through public play, through Titans and other places. But the playing online, and because of the pandemic, we have now become closer as a group. Like we are reaching out to each other more often to check in, to make sure everybody's all right. I got a text message change from one of my players after our game a couple weeks ago, saying thank you, that that he didn't want to be a downer and everything's good, but life had been kind of tough and he'd been kind of fighting some stuff, and the fact that he got to every 2 weeks come and sit online and cut some jokes with us and play some D&D kind of helped him get through it. And so I think there's a lot of that. I'm seeing a lot more online games pop up, and hopefully it's going to fill that niche.
Hopefully so. It's like you were talking about. This is a really good form of escapism for a lot of people. Yep. Some more healthy than others, but right. It's there. It's an outlet. So when that outlet leaves, things get scary. So I'm glad everyone's adapting, but I do think it's interesting, and I hope the community thrives as opposed to it falling apart, because it's become a really beautiful community in recent years.
I agree.
Now, switching course a little bit, but not too much. I think it's pretty safe to say all three of us are pretty huge Star Wars fans in some form.
Star Trek. Sorry.
Oh, no.
Totally joking.
I myself, big fan. I wouldn't say I'm as big of a fan as Keith or even Topher, but pretty big fan as someone with an Ewok tattooed on my arm. I can say that I enjoy Star Wars. So with being a huge Star Wars fan, Topher, how would you say that passion for Star Wars and tabletop games intersect? Obviously there is the Star Wars game, but what actually kind of helps them meet in the middle, if they even do meet in the middle anywhere?
It's funny. I talked about the Star Wars tabletop RPG, which is the current edition is out by a company called Fantasy Flight Games, and my first introduction to Star Wars tabletop RPG was actually an old Wizards of the Coast product, the D20 version of that, which I enjoyed the heck out of it. But the tabletop Star Wars game that I'm most into today is a miniature tabletop war game called Star Wars Legion, where you get the box with your little tiny plastic guys and you got to assemble them and paint them and all that kind of stuff, and you build an army out, and each little guy has a point value, and you can I'm going to play against you, Jesse, and we're going to bring 2 800-point armies. So I got to make sure that my points all work out, and I bring them and set them up, and there's rules for movement and combat and attack and all that kind of stuff. And so that kind of marries two of my worlds, is that I love Star Wars. I like miniature war games also, and I get to take the little plastic dudes and assemble them and paint them, which I find zen. It's very zen for me. I put something on my television. It's usually YouTube or some Keith is not wrong. There's a plethora. By the way, Keith, if you want to dive deep, do an internet search for the best, in quotations, 80s fantasy movies.
Okay.
Oh my God, there's a ton of those on Amazon Prime, and they're not movies that you should be spending all your time focusing on, but they're great background, and I do that, and I love that. So that's the game I play. There was another game called X-Wing, which was a tabletop flight combat game. It was based on a French game, which was World War I biplane fighting.
Interesting.
Called Wings of War. Fantasy Flight licensed the rule set. The funny part is the Wings of War, you didn't need miniatures. You had little cards that were representative of the planes. I think they put miniatures out later, but the original game just had these little cards. And so they took it a step further and put out miniatures. And I played that for a decent amount of time. And then it became, a lot of those type of games become pay to win in my mind, where unless you have the hottest thing, the new figure that came out, or the new ship that came out, and you spend a lot of time min-maxing, then you go play in public events and you just get your butt kicked. So I've been lucky. I found a group of people for Legion who are really just want to paint some cool figures and put them on the table and reenact some Star Wars battles and have fun. Like my friend Jim, who runs Tabletop Engineers, really likes making the scenery. Like he 3D printed a correct scale Millennium Falcon to put on the table and he's done a couple crashed B-Wings, crashed X-Wings, crashed TIE Fighters, like purposely built them in the right scale, and so we could paint them up, put them on the table as scenery and stuff. So that's kind of my tabletop Star Wars Jones is A, I get to build a bunch of cool miniatures, and B, I get to hang out with my friends and talk about Star Wars.
That's awesome. That's really great. and you mentioned miniatures. I'm just wondering if someone were wanting to get into miniatures, where would you suggest that they start? In any sort of fundamental things that they need to have in their possession in order to do this well, or should they just dig in wherever they want to dig in?
Yeah, so I would recommend the way to go is there's a board game. I'm trying to remember the name of it real quickly off the top of my head. It's kind of there's these games called gateway games, right? And
are those like gateway drugs or
almost? Oh, sorry. There's a Games Workshop, which is the 50,000-pound gorilla in the room for tabletop war games with Warhammer 40K.
Oh yes,
they have a fantasy line called Age of Sigmar, which is their fantasy world. But in there, it's almost like a board game, like you would go and buy and. And it has everything in you to play. It has a game board, all the pieces, and it comes in unpainted miniatures called Warhammer Underworld. I think the latest edition is Beast's Grave. Like they come up with a new version of every other year or so. And it comes with 4 or 5 little miniatures you put together. They give you a little paint guide. You go buy your paint, you can paint them up. You don't have to because they come in colored plastic, not just gray. So you can just snap them together. You don't even glue. They snap together. And you can get out there, set it out there. All the rules are there. You and your friend can play this game. But the upside of that is it's a really great gateway because it gives you a small army that you can now take on to something like Warcry, which is the Age of Sigmar skirmish game, which has much smaller models. Warhammer, you can have 200 models on the table at once. Right. This is like 7 or 8 models, and it's really low entry cost, easy to get into. If you like more sci-fi, then I would go with Kill Team, which is really simple kind of thing. There's some other board games. There is Zombicide or Gloomhaven, which use miniatures. And it's almost like a narrative war game. But if you're looking at true, like I'm going to move this far with a ruler and attack my friends, then yeah, I would go with either those because it's all inclusive. Everything you need is in the box. You don't have to buy 10 books and this and that. You buy this one thing for, $50, $75, whatever the price is nowadays. And you can open it up, snap it together and play. And then you can get as detailed as you want into the hobby part of it as you want. That's the whole thing. There's 2 parts of wargaming. There's the playing the war game, which is a huge part of the hobby. And then there's the hobby part of the wargaming, which is just buying and putting and building miniatures. I have bought miniatures for games I'm never going to play because I just think the miniatures look really great. And I bought, a small box set of like 3 or 4 miniatures for, there's a game called Guild Ball, which I'm never going to play this thing. Right? It's a great game, huge community around it.
It's a great name.
Yeah. And one of the guilds is the Brewers Guild.
Oh, nice.
So it's this cool set of these like Scottish dudes in kilts with beer mugs and beer kegs. Right. And it's like and I was like,
people.
These are great. So I bought them and I painted them up because I thought they looked cool. So, so that would be my suggestion, Keith. That's a really good question. Is that there's other games like out there. I would recommend people who want to get into it, go and do it in a YouTube search, specifically YouTube for beginner skirmish war games. There's one called Frostgrave, which there's no specific miniatures. You can use any kind of fancy miniatures you want. And the rules are really cheap. They're like $7 or $8 on Amazon. I think they're $12 if you buy the deluxe version on Amazon. And it's really just, it's super easy to get into. So that's my recommendation. There's some really, really great ones out there. I stopped playing Warhammer. I stopped playing 40K years and years ago, but the announcement of 9th edition, I'm actually getting back into it, and I've bought some figures and some armies, and I'm starting to paint some stuff up, and because they have a new narrative where you don't have to put the 2,000 point army on the board all at once. You start out small, and as you play, you get more points, and you can build your army out, so you're not dropping lots of money all at once.
Nice.
See, I was going to say that's awesome because I've always kind of really enjoyed the miniature side. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm a big fan of model building since I was a kid. I mentioned on the last episode too, I've built Gunplo, which is the building of Gundam plastic model kits, which is where the word Gunplo comes from. But it's been a big thing of mine. I find it extremely zen. It's something I've done since I was about 10 years old. And I actually, Topher, I think you built your first one not too long ago.
I did.
And also found it very enjoyable. So I'm hoping that you'll continue to be a partner in crime in building Gunplo with me.
Yeah.
But there's actually a company or a Kickstarter campaign recently that is a mech tabletop game that uses Gunpla as the pieces. So you build your model kit, but then it has the secondary application of using it in game, and it's basically any robot. So you can use your Transformers model kits, Evangelion stuff, Gundam stuff, Robotech, anything like that. And I found that super interesting because, for me, the Gundams I build are just put them on the shelf, the end, and having that secondary application is super cool. So I've thought that would be a fun way to get into the miniature game. There's also a Dark Souls board game that uses miniatures, and I've thought about getting into that. So I'm not a big board game guy, but I'm a super into Dark Souls. So I think that would be a fun one as well.
If someone is a board gamer who wants to try out miniature gaming, I would have to recommend something like either Zombicide or Gloomhaven. Both of those are pretty immersive board games that can play over multiple sessions. You set it up on the dining room table, especially in a pandemic situation where you're not having people over as often, and you can have, or at all, you and your family can play it, every now and then. I know a buddy of mine has it on a little card table in the side of his room with a camera pointed down on it because he plays with two other friends who live somewhere else in the country, and they own the same game, so they've set it up, and everybody does simultaneous. When he finishes his moves, everybody looks at the screen and goes, okay, then rearranges their boards to match. So when it's their turn, they're looking at their board, they're not looking at a screen.
Let's be honest. I mean, if most people were honest with themselves, the dining room is the least used room in the American home, I believe. So why not go ahead and pick up one of these hobbies?
Right. Exactly. One of the guys in my gaming group just bought one of those high-end custom-built gaming dining room tables, like the kind where the top lifts off and it's recessed and has the whole thing. They just bought a new house. His wife games with him. And they have a couple kids. They're getting into like board games and like entry level games. So they needed a new dining room table for their dining room. He was like, okay, they want the company called Carolina Gaming Tables, which is does some really great stuff. And so, he sent us some pictures and he goes, I bought this big table because I thought we all could come over and play. Maybe some. So he's sitting at one end, waving all the way to the other end to the camera, going, hi. I'm like, all right, dude, you look pathetic.
That's so funny. So we're getting kind of close to time, which means that we're getting into our lightning round. But one thing I wanted to ask you really quick before we get there, what would be something that what is your like dream piece that you want for your gaming collection? For me, it's something, my favorite creature from D&D is the Nightwalker. For some reason, don't know why, but I also love Ints, so I would love a scale model of Treebeard. But what's something that you would want in your collection that you don't necessarily have, but it's absolutely a dream of yours?
Well, that's a really good question.
And I mean, it could even be like a first edition copy of Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, but miniatures is where my head went.
So I'm gonna give you two things here because of what you said at the end. The very first copy of the D&D were these little thin, they call it the white box. They were about the size of a junior sized notebook.
Yeah.
And they were thin. And over the years, either through myself or gifts from players, I've picked up all but two of those books from the original run.
Wow.
So I would love to finish that collection off and have that whole collection. This game means so much to me. It made some great friendships, and it's something I enjoy so much. It's something I really want in my world. Now, for the tabletop itself, right? As much as I would love one of those really high-end Wormwood or Carolina Gaming tables, my wife and I, it was fun when we moved into this house. We talked about buying one, and we decided, no, that's not where we want to spend our resources.
I'm calling Amy. I'm going to get you one.
All right, yeah, you tell her what. Yeah, I want to hear later what she says.
Okay.
I would love to have a 3D like castle that I could open up and use each of the floors.
Oh,
like something I could set on the table, and they go in the front door, and then I can slowly open it up as they go. So as they take the next turn, I reveal it, and take the next turn and reveal it. But, the reality of that, it's not practical, right? Because A, it's going to be freaking huge. And B, once they go through it once, as much as players at least mine, try very hard to keep player knowledge and character knowledge separate. There's always that little bit in the back of the head. They know what's around the turn. Right. So, but yeah, that's something like that, whether it be a giant castle or a giant, dungeon that's set up that it's easily configurable. There are companies out there like Dwarven Forge, and now
I was going to mention Dwarven Forge.
There's a new set that just came out from WizKids called Warlock Tiles, which are much more inexpensive, and they're compatible with a 3D printing system you can lock together. There's the guys I was talking about earlier, the tabletop terrain guys who do all the things.
Mm-hmm.
There's one called Black Magic Craft, and though they specifically have systems to build these little tiny tiles for cheap off of literally like insulation foam and cereal box cardboard, and build these systems, and you can build them all out and put them together and build it very quickly and do that kind of stuff. So it's out there for me to do. I just really want, I don't know, there was I don't know if it was Adam Savage. I think it was Adam Savage who did an video interview with a guy from Weta.
Oh yeah. And they did the robot game.
No, this was, yes, but no. This was the guy, he was the model maker for the Hobbit movies, Lord of the Rings and Hobbit, and he took it to the next level, and he built out these gorgeous modular buildings for this fantasy village. I think they may have actually done a Kickstarter for it at some point, where he was doing resin printing, and he was painting them, and they're gorgeous. And like, that's what I want. As much as I like to build things, I would love to just show up one day and there'd be a box on my front porch, and here is the stuff that was already pre-built, pre-painted, ready to go. I slap it on the table and I run my game.
Well, the Mega Millions jackpot for this week is $124 million. So
there you go.
Make
That's
sure
right.
you get your ticket.
Good call. Good call. I hope that answered the question, Jess.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's great.
Yeah. You guys ready for the lightning round?
Lightning round.
Can we get the rights to Thunderstruck for our lightning round music for the next episode?
I can just do it off key on my own guitar, and maybe that'll be enough to get around any copyright infringements. What do you think?
I don't think Angus and gang would mind anyway. Well, we should be fine. Let's just go ahead and use it.
Hey, all 10 of our listeners, don't turn us in. Just kidding.
I think we'll get 11 with this one.
Okay. All right. Chris, Chris, I don't know. I called you by the first half of your first name. Topher, do you want to go for 12 or do you want to go for 13?
13.
All right. Good,
buddy.
Good number. All right. Here we go. The lightning round questions, and we'll finish this out for the rest of the podcast here. All right, Topher, how do you think your hobbies have contributed to your success in your full-time work?
It allows me to organize and talk in front of large groups of people and help me get through to different diversities.
Awesome. If you could be one fictional character, who would it be?
Aragorn.
Nice. What other interests would you like to pursue if time wasn't a constraint?
Professional barbecuer.
Ooh, nice. Well, that is it for the lightning round. But I have seen a lot of your rib posts on Facebook, and my mouth waters each time. But nice. And you were a big Weber Smoky Mountain Smoker user?
All three of my grills are Webers. My gas grill's a Weber. I own a 22-inch kettle and a Weber Smoky Mountain smoker. So yeah, I'm a Weber fanboy.
This episode brought to you by Weber.
One would hope. Come on. We need sponsors here, people. Let's do this.
There's a video that somebody sent me because of something else of a guy's video podcast called Dude Dads. Jess, you should totally find this guy. It's got you written all over it, right? But every time he mentions a brand name, he would go like, Weber, not a sponsor. Yet. Then looks at the camera and goes, yet.
So judging by our episodes so far, let's see, what do we have so far? Funimation, not a sponsor yet. Crunchyroll, not a sponsor yet. Bandai Namco, not a sponsor yet. That's the one I'm going for. Titan Games. Let's go ahead and throw in Dragon's Lair.
Let's go ahead and throw in Dungeons and Dragons,
So Dragon's Lair would be our friendly neighborhood gaming store.
Good.
Huge comic book place, gigantic store. They have tons of games that you can play. Super cool. Pretty close to our office and where Keith lives. A little bit of a trek for me, but that's it. The place is awesome.
Right.
So with that, anything else we want to cover? If not, we'll call this a wrap.
We be rapping.
Topher's dancing for anyone that can't see because this won't have video attached to it. I like it.
Eventually
Topher
we will.
A glorious beard where I shaved mine so that my daughter could not pull it, which I'm glad I did. Topher has grown in my place, and it is fantastic.
Yeah, all the gray shows in now. Like my true age is shown.
You should have seen mine right before Joy was born. There was some salt coming in. It was crazy.
Too soon. Yeah. You're too young for that.
Yeah, with where we work, it makes sense. Mm-hmm. We'll go there.
We'll leave it at that.
But again, thank you so much for being our first guest, Topher. It was an absolute pleasure. Always enjoy talking with you, and an absolute honor to have you as guest number 1.
Heck yeah.
It was my honor, by all means. You guys are rock stars, not just in the industry we're in, but just as human beings. So I think this podcast is not just fun, but I think it's something we need because, as you said earlier, Jesse, we're not going to get to hang out with this extended family of ours in the relatively near future, if not the future. And this helps us keep together and let us know about these things. I know I've had conversations about Magic and Dungeons and Dragons and Star Wars with many people in our community sitting around the Breeze Bar.
Mm-hmm.
For our listeners, and I think it's just great. I think it's fantastic you guys are doing this. And if anybody of your listeners have any questions, don't hesitate to have them reach out.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And if you want to be a guest, if you know us or know someone interesting that you think would be an awesome guest for the show, please let us know. This isn't exclusive to the SEO industry. It's just the people that we know. So that's where we're starting. So definitely let us know, and we'll send you a little form. You can fill it out, or also the website will have a form that you can fill out as for guest information if you're interested. So keep an eye out for that. But again, thank you so much, Topher, for being a guest. I'm Jesse.
And I'm Keith.
Thank you so much, and have a good day, guys.
Ciao for now. This has been the Austin Otaku Podcast. To learn more about us and our show, to be a guest, or to subscribe to our show, go to www.austinotaku.com and follow us on Facebook and Twitter.